Yeah, I mean, look, we're at that point of year where hopefully we're gearing up for the regular season. The fact that it took this long for the Dodgers to get Dave back under contract for, obviously for the next 3 years plus this year, 4 years total, it seems a little bit, interesting to me. They've been such a good marriage, Dave and that organization. They've done so many great things over a long period of time now. For one person to be in one place and to never have heard a single bad thing about him, getting to meet him, getting to hang out with him and his players in the offseason, which I've gotten to do a time or two, knowing some people in that organization. He is revered by the players and the people that he essentially sets the tone for. They love him, and he's been rewarded as such.
Now, I love that you mentioned that, because I have to agree, you take a look at the resume here for him. I mean, 9 seasons, 2 of those with the title. What's crazy is after that 2020 season, it wasn't a World Series.
Oh,
it didn't count. He finally got it off his back this year. And people were even going so far as to say, well, since that one didn't count, he should be in a hot seat. Maybe we need someone else. So I just think so much of this organization for backing him, for seeing he never lost the clubhouse with any type of struggle or any situation, so many injuries that they've gone through. And then he showed out. He said, okay, you want a full 162 and the commissioner's trophy? Then we'll just do it again.
In a season with, I mean, can you remember a team overcoming as many injury and adversity issues, especially when one unit of their team, the starting rotation for that team going into the playoffs, nobody thought they were going to have enough pitching to make it through. And him, that front office, and members of their staff, they got together, they formulated a plan, and then they executed it to perfection on the biggest stage in the playoffs and throughout the World Series last year, and ended up winning the title in a year when, yes, going into the season, everyone had high hopes, but by the time the postseason began, there was a lot of negativity surrounding this team, not in that team, but surrounding that team from a media perspective and where they were going to go, how far they were going to be able to get. Well, guess what? They proved everybody wrong again. They did it in a year in 2020 when I could argue was much harder to get through that gauntlet and win a World Series. And then they did it again last year. Really impressive, and just so happy for that organization to have his leadership moving forward for the foreseeable future.
You mentioned that adversity, and I love a catcher's perspective on this more than probably anybody else. 17 different starting pitchers. How difficult is that, especially given the success?
Yeah, I mean, look, and I could speak at it from a catcher's perspective, getting to know that many people and trying to understand not just pitch types and what they like to throw, but personalities, motivational techniques, and just the ways that you need to interact with them. And then from a managerial perspective, the way that Dave and that organization were able to handle that, understanding how to utilize these guys and put them in situations where they can be successful. That's knowing them on a totally different level, right? 17 different starting pitchers, knowing all of them to an extent to where you're able to fit them and put them in places to be successful, and make sure that in the long run, by the time you get to the postseason, that you understand what you have in-house and you're able to maximize those strengths. That really takes a lot of forecasting and future planning that they did throughout the course of a season, and probably the last couple of seasons, to get to know those guys, to put them in those kinds of situations.
The best managers are usually the selfless ones. They're not thinking about them going into the year. But does it make it a little more easier for that whole clubhouse that now that's not in his mind? He's got a new, bigger runway ahead of him.
I hope so. I mean, and that's why you're glad that something like this comes through. I know, look, I've been in an organization when there's coaching changes, right? Not necessarily a manager change, but I've been in the middle of a season when we've had a hitting coach fired or someone else leave the organization. So to see the opposite happen, and you see the continuity, and someone comes in and they get rewarded, and it's like, okay, no, we have a defined vision for what we want, not just this year, but for the next 4 years now with Dave at the helm, and there's going to be that continuity. That really does speak volumes in that clubhouse, and it lets you as a player just feel so much more content with where you're at. And it eases the stress on everybody in that organization, that at least on that coaching staff, because they all feel like, okay, my manager's back, I'm back, I could just focus on the task at hand, and the players feel that too. It trickles down, and it really does help the organization move forward.
Oh, they are throwing down the gauntlet for the 2025 season, looking to repeat. Meanwhile, good news on the West Coast. tougher news on. They will look for a second opinion. This coming in from Brian Hoke. Gerrit Cole is in Los Angeles today for a meeting with Dr. Neil ElAttrache. Yankees manager Aaron Boone told Yes Network earlier. Now, for those who are aware, when the Tommy John wave started, Dr. Andrews was the big name.
He was the name.
Industry. And of course, at some point, everybody has to retire, the baton being passed to Dr. ElAttrache. And so you try to remove the stigma that visit automatically means Tommy John. And the reality is this visit is not a new one for Gerrit Cole.
Yeah, this is something we saw happen last year, March 13th of last year. He had this meeting with the same guy. Fortunately, last year, decent news in that it was just kind of get some rest, see what happens in the next couple of weeks. And he was able to come back, what was it, in June of last year. So, and really make an impact on this team and help them get to the World Series. Look, you don't want to kind of project out like what's coming, from that meeting today. But knowing that he had that meeting last year, knowing, that there was an issue there, that, it did subside, but it just kind of puts that in the back of your ear, in the back of your mind and in your ear, this could be coming. And unfortunately, with him having to go again this year, I think the outlook going into this meeting isn't as good as it was last year. So it seems like it could be one of those where the Yankees could be without Cole for a significant amount of time.
Now, a lot of focus has been on how many pitchers teams can collect because we've watched you need at least 8 to maybe get through a season when you're looking at the rotation.
What did we say, 17 with the Dodgers last year?
Exactly. So I think that just goes to show, but you also have to remember that the Yankees had some departures as well. I love that they went out and got Max Fried, and of course you're kind of wondering what do you get from Carlos Rodon and Marcus Stroman, but do they have to go get somebody else? I mean, the AL East it's a little more in flux this year than it usually is, but it's the Yankees.
Yeah, I think what we see here with the Yankees is that when they put it on paper and they had Gerrit Cole in that rotation and they had Clark Schmidt in that rotation, and they look at that, and as a fan, as you look at that, as you're evaluating this team, you think, wow, yeah, like the sky's the limit. They have great starting pitching. The problem is what's coming, 162 game season plus spring training, the inevitability that you're going to lose guys across that time frame. And then what is your depth? What does that look like? And how is that going to play out over the course of 162? That's where it gets a little bit dicey. And when you look at that list, you start to think it gets really short, really fast. And you start to wonder, what are some of these question marks? Who are some of these names, and how are they going to respond in some of these situations throughout the course of 162? For a team like the Yankees that have the type of expectations that they do coming into this season, this was thought of, okay, you're coming off of the World Series loss, you lose Juan Soto, but you go out and make some moves for a Max Fried, for a Cody Bellinger, and you try to retool. Okay, are you ready to do that? It seemed like it. Then things like this kind of hit, big speed bumps in the road. Now where do you go? Are they able to pivot somewhere? That's going to be a really big question for this organization.
I love one thing we were trying to get into earlier, which is so immensely complex, is spending. We've talked about this right down the road. Steve Cohen and the Mets created a whole new tax bracket for his team. And so it's almost
literally
this middle ground of, we don't really want to follow somebody who's across the road from us, but at the same time, you almost do have to compete with those expectations.
This is where it gets interesting with the Yankees, because throughout this offseason, I think we at least heard a little bit of a different rhetoric than we had heard in previous seasons. Previous seasons, it was, like we kind of have a limit, not that we're, it's more self-imposed and we're going to be mindful of that. We didn't hear that as much this offseason, right? I think it was more, okay, we lost out on Soto, knowing how much money they were putting into that pot, and it came back to them. They put it elsewhere. They reallocated, which is great. Now it's, okay, you may have to retool again without a Gerrit Cole. Where do you go, and how much money are you willing to spend? Are you willing to do it right now? And when I look at this roster, at least from a starting, rotation projection, where they're at, are they willing to stomach going into a season not really knowing how that's going to play out, and some of those names on the bottom of that list are going to play out? Are the names at the top of that list going to stay healthy? So where do you go? Are you going to go make a trade and bring in Dylan Cease or other names that we've heard out there on the market this offseason? Is that a possibility? Well, are they willing to take on the payroll that would come with some of those names? And that's where it gets a little bit dicey. And then you think about, and this is great timing, You think about some of the names that they've traded away over the last couple of years to make some acquisitions, mostly on the offensive side of the ball. And I mean, these are all starting pitchers that are going to be helping other organizations this coming season and not helping this year. That is a deep list of guys that it would be nice to even just have half of those still, under control. If you're the Yankees, you think of Nestor Cortez leaving this year. Obviously, those names at the top all went for Juan Soto last offseason. That's going to be really tough for them to overcome if this is indeed something long-term for Gerrit Cole.
It's going to be interesting, and we're also reminded, too, that Giancarlo Stanton, you mentioned the offense, is another big question mark as he's got issues with both elbows. But the Yankees press on. You can't